Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism, 1993, stands as one of the most influential works of post-colonial scholarship of the late 20th century, extending and deepening the revolutionary critique he first articulated in Orientalism, 1978. While Orientalism revealed how Western knowledge systems constructed the Orient as an exotic, inferior counterpart to Europe, Culture and Imperialism broadens the scope to examine the vast cultural, literary, and ideological formations that supported and normalized imperial domination. Said argues that imperialism was not simply a political or economic venture, it was profoundly cultural. Novels, operas, travel writing, anthropology, and even concepts of aesthetic taste were embedded in, and often dependent on, a global structure of domination. The book's central argument is that Western culture cannot be understood apart from the imperial enterprise that shaped it. Imperialism, defined as the power-driven domination of distant territories and peoples, was not just out there in the colonies, it was present in the very texture of European cultural identity. This foregrounding of culture as an active political force is what distinguishes Said's approach from traditional Marxist or purely historical analyses. Culture, in Said's view, is both a site of complicity and a potential site of resistance. The novel as imperial form. One of the most compelling aspects of Said's analysis is his reading of the 19th century novel. He argues that canonical works by Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Joseph Conrad, and Rudyard Kipling are not merely literary masterpieces, but ideological products of an imperial world system. Austen's Mansfield Park, for example, famously depends on the wealth of the Bertram estate in Antigua, a detail often ignored by traditional critics but crucial to Said's reading. This wealth, extracted from colonial plantations and slavery, becomes the silent foundation upon which the tranquility and morality of English domestic life rest. Said insists that these geographical gaps are not incidental, but structurally necessary. The realist novel, particularly in Britain, derived its stability and order from the assumption of an imperial world that ensured prosperity and predictability at home. Thus, the novel becomes a narrative form that both reflects and reproduces imperial ideology. It maps the world according to the priorities of metropolitan life, turning the colonies into peripheral spaces that exist only to provide resources and moral contrast. In contrast, Conrad's Heart of Darkness reveals the contradictions of this system. While often celebrated as an anti-imperialist text, Said sees Conrad as both critical of imperial violence and yet trapped within an imperial gaze that cannot imagine true decolonization. The colonized remain voiceless, and the European narrator frames the meaning of their existence. Conrad thus becomes a transitional figure, a writer aware of the moral crisis of empire, but unable to envision alternatives. Contrapuntal reading and the politics of interpretation. A major methodological innovation introduced in Culture and Imperialism is the concept of contrapuntal reading. Borrowing the term from music, Said proposes that we read texts with awareness of the multiple, overlapping histories they contain. Just as musical counterpoint allows different melodies to coexist, a contrapuntal reading of a 19th century English novel brings into view the histories of colonized peoples that remain unspoken but structurally essential. For Said, this is not merely an interpretive practice, it is an ethical one. It requires recognizing how Western literature is inseparable from the colonial worlds it often silences. At the same time, contrapuntal reading allows us to uncover stories of resistance, agency, and alternative cultural visions embedded within the imperial archive. Said's method thus encourages readers to approach literature with an awareness of global interconnectedness, what he calls the worldliness of texts, their embeddedness in material histories and power relations. Culture as a battlefield of empire. Said contends that imperialism was sustained not only by military and economic force, but by cultural narratives that legitimized domination. Western representations framed the colonized as backward, childlike, or dangerous, justifying paternalistic or violent interventions. Culture naturalized inequality. It made empire seem like a civilizing mission rather than exploitation. Yet culture also offered tools for resistance. One of the book's most powerful sections examines anti-imperialist movements and the emergence of national cultures in places like India, Africa, and the Arab world. Said highlights figures such as Chinua Achebe, Frantz Fanon, C.L.R. James, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who challenged colonial narratives by writing back to the empire. These writers recentered indigenous perspectives and histories, exposing the distortions of colonial discourse and constructing new cultural identities grounded in local experiences. Said argues that decolonization is not simply a political process, but a cultural one. The struggle for independence involved reclaiming languages, memories, and narratives suppressed by colonial rule. Culture becomes a terrain where power is contested, a site of ongoing negotiation rather than a static collection of artifacts. Empires' afterlives and the contemporary world. Although culture and imperialism focuses primarily on the 19th and early 20th centuries, its relevance extends far beyond that historical moment. Said warns that even after formal colonialism ended, imperial attitudes persist in global politics, media, and popular culture. The book anticipates debates about globalization, neocolonialism, and cultural hegemony decades before they became mainstream. Said's critique of American foreign policy and its cultural representation of the Middle East is particularly prescient. He suggests that new forms of empire operate through economic domination, military interventions, and the global circulation of images that shape public opinion. The othering of non-Western societies continues to justify interventions framed as humanitarian or democratic missions. This afterlife of empire underscores the book's urgent message. Understanding history and culture requires acknowledging the persistence of unequal power relations. Only by recognizing these connections can we create a more just global order. A humanistic vision. A central feature of Said's thought is his grounding in humanism. Unlike some post-colonial theorists who reject the Western canon, Said insists that European literature remains valuable, but only when approached critically and contrapuntally. His goal is not to discard Austen, Dickens, or Conrad, but to expand the frame through which we read them, making space for suppressed perspectives and alternative histories. Said envisions a global humanism rooted in dialogue rather than domination, one that acknowledges cultural differences without transforming them into hierarchies. This humanism is not abstract or sentimental, it is political, grounded in the recognition of shared responsibility and interconnected histories. It calls for solidarity across borders and a commitment to justice in cultural interpretation. Conclusion. The enduring significance of Said's work, culture, and imperialism is a monumental contribution to cultural critique and post-colonial studies. It challenges readers to rethink the foundations of Western culture and to confront the ethical implications of imperial history. Said's analysis demonstrates that culture is never innocent. It is woven into the structures of power that shape our world. At the same time, the book offers a hopeful vision. By reading contrapuntally, by listening to silenced voices, and by acknowledging the global entanglements of culture, we can transform how we understand literature, history, and ourselves. Said invites us to imagine a world where cultural exchange is based not on domination, but on respect and reciprocity. Even 3 decades after its publication, Culture and Imperialism remains essential reading, both a critique of the past and a guide for understanding the cultural politics of the present.